Hi, everyone, and welcome to Aligning Business to the Cloud Era. I'm Farah Hain. I'm going to be the moderator on the webinar today. I figure we'll wait. I see additional people dialing in. We'll just wait a minute or two, not more than that, just to make sure that people have time to get in, and then we can start with the program. So give us one more minute to see that a few more people are coming on. We'll be right back. Okay, thank you for joining. We are going to get started. Wanted to give a minute or two for people to join in, but it looks like we have a nice group already on, waiting for the webinar. Thank you very much for coming today. We're going to talk about aligning business to the cloud era. My name is Farah Hain. I'm the VP of Corporate Marketing at Zerto, and I'm going to be the moderator today. Talking to you will be the three gentlemen that I have sitting with me. First off is Ken Stamp, Systems Engineer at Zerto. He has a 20-year involvement in IT, focused on storage and virtualization, DR, and replication. He's been at EMC and Veritas, and also spent some time at Kasia. Our founders, Ziv and Oded Kedem, were previously at Kasia and sold that company to EMC, also in the replication space. So thank you, Ken, for joining. We also have with us Mike Husid, who is in the product management team at Zerto, focusing specifically on cloud, private, public, and hybrid clouds. He's going to talk a lot today about DR as a service and other cloud opportunities that he sees. He comes from Akamai and Red Hat and a bunch of other startups, and got his degree at MIT. Also with us is Harry Smith, who's a tech evangelist at Zerto. And as a tech evangelist, Harry is focusing on driving adoption of Zerto's products across clouds, hypervisors, and all sorts of platforms. Before he was at Zerto, he spent 8 years at VMware in professional services and as a senior consultant. You can find him on Twitter at Harry S.III. So you can feel free to ping him on Twitter after. So thank you. A couple of housekeeping items just before we join. First of all, you didn't realize that you were in for a treat today. All of you who stayed to the end of the webinar will be treated to a special promo code for ZertoCon, which is the Zerto event happening May 22nd to 24th in Boston. There'll be a promo code where you'll get a 50% off ZertoCon attendance. So please stay till the end, you'll get that code. The second housekeeping item is about questions. So it should be pretty simple inside the panel that you all see, the GoToWebinar panel, just to ask us a question. I see someone already did. If you have any questions at all, put them there, and we will be taking questions from all of you. We would love this to be interactive, where we are able to grab your questions and go and direct those questions to our panel while we have them. So let's dive in. first. The first question that we're going to start with is why cloud, why now? And I really just want to introduce our panel and the things that we'll be discussing today by sort of setting the stage, right? Whether we're talking about private cloud or public clouds or that combination of the two known as a hybrid cloud, complex applications are today running in cloud. Gartner predicts that $1 trillion will be shifted to the cloud IT market over the next 5 years. And so what is this? What are we talking about? That is the subject of our webinar today. What is the cloud opportunity, and how can you align your business priorities, your IT priorities, to that cloud opportunity? And you'll see some of the things that we'll talk about later in the presentation here. Total cost of ownership improvement, better asset utilization, resource allocation, scale, and agility are all benefits people are talking about of going to the cloud that we will cover today. The first thing I'd like to do is actually start with a question for one of our panelists. Harry, could you tell me a little bit about the drivers for moving to cloud? What are the things that you think, what do you see when you've been talking to customers? You work very closely at VMware directly with customers. What are you seeing today as the drivers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There are quite a few big ones across the board, and they hit the enterprise at different times. But you think about asset utilization and trying to capture usage of infrastructure, and the support around that and maintenance is very overwhelming, and sometimes you can't grow fast enough to accommodate your business. You look at the ROI of everything you're investing in real estate and hardware and people and resources. So those factors come in together, and they're putting pressure on those resources that are already trying to do enough. And it's always that incentive and initiative to do more with less constantly. So being able to offload some of that to a cloud space is extremely attractive to organizations, and you have to be able to manage that change and that growth, even if it's just burstability of using the cloud sometimes when you need it, that on-demand mentality.
What would you say about ROI of cloud?
It comes back up to gaining that return on investment around like I said, about real estate and different leases and sites, and not having to invest in that hardware where it's normally a large cost with a lot of maintenance and uptake and upkeep and dollars spent across all of your sites, and so many factors that go into it, and also the investment in your people and the expertise you need to maintain this infrastructure where you may not have needed it originally, but technology is changing, and the options you have available to you are changing. So in order to adopt new technology, you need to have the expertise and the training, so you can rely on clouds for that and not worry about it anymore.
And then, Harry, what are you seeing as some of the impediments, right? So you made a good case. What are you seeing now as, impediments of faster adoption, right? If this is really starting now, why are we not seeing everything moving? Why are there some slowdowns? Why would customers still have doubts?
There are a lot of, the doubts, the scary stories that you hear, or you hear a rumor from another person in the telephone game of conversations spreading around. We're going to dive a lot deeper into some of these points a little later as well, but the application rationalization, people want to touch and feel resources, so even virtualization is a challenge. Never mind now you're virtualizing it and moving it somewhere where I can't even go see where it's living and look through the window at it. And how does it perform? I don't know if it will perform correctly, compliance, control, and do I have control around these machines and my servers and applications and workloads? I need to know what's going on. There are so many clouds, there's so many choices to make.
Mike, can you also address that a little bit? Can you tell us what you've been seeing about customers' reluctance? Because cloud is really your area of expertise. What do you see?
So, Harry is absolutely right. One of those big things is control. Once you go to the public cloud, there's a lot of things in the public cloud, a lot of components that you no longer control. It's controlled by somebody else, including hardware, including virtualization, including other aspects of your underlying infrastructure. And now you basically see the control to somebody else is going to be working. Are you going to have a problem of noisy neighbors? All those things bring up the control issues, but that's not the only one. The other one is really the skill set. Going to the cloud requires slightly different skill set, and it requires learning about this new environment where the items are different, and where the building out the environment has a different expertise. It requires different different tools and different processes to deploy business application in the public cloud. And then let's say you finally invest time and you learn the skills and you develop the tools and you are on one of the clouds. Well, guess what? Now you have a cloud lock-in. Now the question is, can you get out of that cloud if something changes and your business dictates you to move to a different cloud? So those things are very important, and it's for organizations to figure out: do you go to the cloud? Do you go to the right cloud, the wrong cloud? What happens if you don't? If you go to the cloud and you don't succeed, how do you come back from the cloud? Can you come back from the cloud? All those things are wide open questions.
Okay.
There's so many factors and questions, like you said, and unknowns, and as people have dug into this, those have extrapolated into just more fear until they can do the research, right? So that's what we're here for today.
So I've collected a few pieces of information from a study that we saw about how worried IT pros are about this still, right? Seeing opportunity, but still concerned in a few different areas. And Mike, one of them was exactly what you mentioned. 31% say they don't currently have the necessary job skills to lead a cloud deployment. And 37% said they lack the knowledge of which workloads to migrate, right? So they need some help deciding what is a cloud application that is relevant or applicable for going to the cloud, right? What should be pushed to the cloud. And then 50% say it's on us, it's on the vendors. We still don't have the tools that we need to have that control, to have the ability to see what we need to see and control our applications in the cloud, right? So I wanted to point out something interesting that came through. This is an actual email that we got from a prospect to Zerto. And the prospect had been reached out to after an event where we did a presentation on Microsoft Azure and how Zerto works with helping customers get into Azure and replicate their applications into Azure. And what we saw is, the way that this question came up really points to the problem. We've been discussing internally what tool may be an enabler to allow us to move certain workloads from our private data center into Microsoft Azure. They're looking to vendors to help solve the problem of what workloads should I move, how can I do this easily, and can we discuss? So I thought this was appropriate because this is an exact case point, right, of what we're talking about, that an IT pro is looking for some help on knowing what to move and how to get it into Azure, even though he's decided already that Azure is something interesting. So tell me a little bit, Mike, if you could talk a little bit about public cloud, because this customer was specifically interested in Azure, but public cloud is, of course, AWS and Google Cloud, and right, there are many options for public cloud. Can you lay the landscape a little bit first about public cloud? Who are the players, and what are we talking about when we say public cloud?
So, public cloud is a big concept because there are lots of things which I mentioned as a cloud in modern enterprises. And obviously, as you mentioned, Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services, AWS, are two big players. And if you go to Gartner reports, to Gartner Magic Quadrant, they're going to be in the leader quadrant for the public clouds. But then there are at least 8 more companies in that Magic Quadrant, which are pretty close to the leaders, either in challengers. And that's not even the limit of the cloud. Another way how we see cloud being adopted right now is with software as a service. Well, that also runs in the cloud. For example, one of the most popular software as a service application is Office 365. So that's when customers migrate from the Exchange and maybe even SharePoint and other on-premise installations of Microsoft Communications into the cloud and get deployments on Office 365. For example, we use SharePoint within Zerto, SharePoint Online, it works great. And then it's one of those environments where we just go and use it. Microsoft hosts it. It runs somewhere. We don't know where. But, with enough security, we trust that it's going to work. And that's one of the ways to use cloud. So that's one part, software as a service. Another part is native applications. If you're a developer and if you go out to GitHub, there's going to be hundreds, literally hundreds of different frameworks and examples how you can build an application to work natively in the public cloud. And those applications are great. They use all the modern technologies available in the public cloud. For example, there is a new paradigm of serverless computing, something that Amazon introduced. It's called Amazon Lambda. And there's also an equivalent on Azure. It's called Azure Functions. And that's very new. Many people don't understand it. And as I said, in order to understand it, it's probably the best way is to go to GitHub, download examples, how people use Lambda or functions to deploy serverless computing, and how to build new applications. And then there is, within developer, just made it so easy, and consumption of public cloud is so easy. The developer can pull out a credit card, open an account on one of the public clouds, and start building applications there. Doing a web server or WordPress was probably trivial. So now we get into hard stuff. Hard stuff is, well, that's all great and stuff, all those new things, but the enterprises run a lot of stuff on their own premises. And, those are core business applications, custom applications, which are designed to basically to run their business and to respond to the business needs. And now when we go to those applications, that becomes difficult. They're running the business processes I established. How do you move them to public cloud?
Okay, so let me then just ask that, let me frame that. Are you saying that if you have existing applications on your on-premise environment, you have to do some sort of re-architecting to get them into public cloud?
Well, some people do. In a way, it may or may not be required. Depends on the application. There's really no easy answer for this question. It depends on the application. It depends on the environment. It depends on many factors, how the application was designed and how it is running right now.
Are there applications that are better and or worse for moving to public cloud?
I think the right answer here is it depends. It depends. It's a very hard question to answer without knowing what an application is. So it requires really looking at the application, really looking at the application in that new environment and seeing, is it going to work? Does it have all the prerequisites? Is there some hidden things within the application, hidden dependencies that the application depends on? And is it going to run? And once it runs, well, that's only half the problem. The second problem is going to perform in the public cloud. Because performance is as big of an issue in public cloud in a different environment than it is in the on-premise environment.
So if we look at this slide, we see that, kind of if you have a VMware or Hyper-V environment, or you're running your application on an on-prem environment, you have a lot of options ahead of you, and we put a few of them up here, right? So you talked a little bit, Mike, about Amazon and AWS and Microsoft Azure. Harry, explain to us what's going on the sort of managed cloud side. What is a managed cloud? Is that a public cloud? How should people use it? Could it be utilized for managing applications in the cloud?
Yeah, it gets tricky, especially terminology-wise. So I want to level set this audience to how I see it today, because my previous experience and history was there's private cloud and there's public cloud and there's a mix, the hybrid. And I try not to use that because I think we've realized public means different things to different people. In this case, it's usually backed by a vendor in the cloud that they created on their own software, right, like we just talked about and Mike mentioned. So that's when we throw in that last term of a hosted or managed cloud provider. They still might be public to you because it's not yours, but just a different terminology set here. So a managed or public cloud, cloud service offering is infrastructure somewhere else that's not yours usually, but not even in all cases. I've worked as a hosted provider where you can also rent space and you still manage everything yourself, or you pay them an additional service fee to manage it for you and still attain the services, as Michael mentioned, from the public cloud side, software as a service or infrastructure as a service, that they can provide to you and you just utilize. You don't really care what's on the back end. You don't want to care. You just need it running all the time. So we'll dig in a lot deeper into all the what all this means, but that's the real distinction here between when we mention public versus cloud service provider or managed cloud.
Okay, so let me ask you then, in sort of the managed cloud areas, we talked about some applications that are relevant for moving to cloud. Let's talk about some reasons someone would go to a managed cloud or a public cloud. And we obviously here at Zerto, we see use cases around disaster recovery, right? That's typically the type of things that we're dealing with here, sometimes migrations and other things, moving applications for other reasons into the cloud. But so explain to me how someone might use a cloud for the purposes of DR and what that looks like in a managed cloud is DR as a service. Mike, you want to take that and
yeah, sure.
Chime in.
So data recovery as a service, or DRS, is one of those new things which came out probably a number of years ago, and it's really becoming popular these days. And it's interesting and actually very convenient use case to go to the cloud with that particular type of service. And the main reasons are the same thing we already mentioned. Its ability to use resource efficiently, to have multi-tenant environment where you don't have to buy servers. I guess Harry talked about that a little bit as well. And in general, just sharing resources, especially in the DR environment where you don't have to pay for the second site, where somebody else is managing it, it just creates a better story around the scale and really creates a business case for a provider to provide those services, and then for an enterprise to consume those services at much lower costs, at more efficient way than if they were to build the disaster recovery solution themselves. And there are other services which disaster recovery service enables. For example, some of those things is a testing environment. So as I was saying, there's a great uncertainty. Will the application actually work on that site? And many disaster recovery solutions provide testing infrastructure, failover testing infrastructure, where you can run a test failover instead of real failover, and that creates a copy of the environment that you have in the production site on the DR environment. And then you can use that environment to troubleshoot problems. You can give it to your dev or test groups. Or there are many other things you can look at how that application will run without actually causing a disruption to your production application. So now that you have this option, it's really up to the question that Harry was mentioning is how you're going to do it. Are you going to do it yourself? Are you looking for a self-service provider? Or will you leverage somebody else's expertise in doing it? And then we talk about the managed service providers. So whether you do shared management or you do dedicated management, all those options are valid options within the DRS space. So that really creates a paradigm shift in the DRS world to
I'd love to ask a little bit more about that. Ken, if you could sort of define for us, you put some notes here together for people to look at. What does that mean? What is a paradigm shift? What paradigm shift is happening here in the DR and cloud space?
So in order to put a finer point on DR as a service, it's worthwhile rewinding a bit and looking at, how did people accomplish DR in the past? And how are they doing it today? And increasingly, how are we seeing our customers go towards the future? Traditionally, enterprises have leveraged their backup and restore infrastructure as a DR mechanism, and that was fine in the past. And by the way, by backup and restore infrastructure, I'm talking about infrastructures powered by things like Commvault, NetBackup, NetWorker, and TSM, which, by the way, is now known as IBM Spectrum Protect. But all of these have been fine. But today, they fundamentally suffer from two different shortcomings. One is the lack of RPO and granularity. And what do I mean by that? I mean the potential for data loss. If your traditional backup and recover cycle is a day, it's increasingly unacceptable for enterprises to lose up to a day's worth of transactions. That simply isn't going to fly today. The other shortcoming is, of course, RTO, or time to recovery, for enterprises that are online 24 hours a day and whose customers certainly expect it to be, lest they go to another vendor. It's unacceptable to be down for anything more than a few seconds. never mind a day or whatever the time it takes to do that restore that was as a result of a backup operation. Because it's important to realize that whenever you want to do a restore, whenever you did a backup, there's probably going to be a restore, and the restore time is going to significantly add to your RTO. And typically that's on the order of hours at the very least to perhaps days. And that, of course, is unacceptable. I'll also mention that the RTO really doesn't matter whether you're backing up traditionally to, well, tape or increasingly to disk, because both require some kind of restore cycle before you can actually bring up your servers, be they virtual or physical.
So Ken, let me ask you on that, right? You see these things in the news all the time. A company, has some sort of outage, and it takes them quite a while to get back up online. And by then, they've been sort of crucified in the press, and everybody's, having trouble believing that they don't have whatever it is in the back end, IT department that it takes to restore instantly, right? So what's going on there in terms of, could Cloud DR play a role in solving that? Why would you say, okay, we can solve that by moving DR to the cloud?
So before we talk to moving DR to the cloud, let's talk about moving from backup to a simple replication infrastructure, which typically solves the problem of RPO because you can deploy replication infrastructures that actually feature synchronous operation for those workloads and those data sets and those applications that can't suffer any data loss, or async replication, where some data loss is acceptable for those less critical apps. And so you've seen over the past, decade or so, traditional storage-based replication for physical workloads, and these are typically based on arrays technology. For virtualized workloads, of course, Zerto was the innovator in terms of fully hypervisor-based DR replication and recovery. This has solved that issue of RPO and has also solved the RTO issue, because when you replicate data, however you're doing it, your data is there to begin with. In other words, there's no restore phase necessary. It's there ready to use as soon as you want. Now, to answer your question about going to the cloud, any DR mechanism kind of implies a second site. You might have a production site, you might have several production sites, but you're going to need at least one more site for DR. Now, you may already have it, and it may already be another production site, but it's going to be an infrastructure that you have to account for, if not provision, and it costs money. What's powering and what's incentivizing customers to start doing DR to the cloud, there are a number of factors, and these include obviously not having to spin up and have running an infrastructure, a physical infrastructure, and allowing it to be much more flexible, reducing your expense, having less resources to manage all of this, essentially not having to deal with it being yours. Our customers inevitably really want to get out of being in the data center business. They want to be in the whatever their business is.
So let me ask you about that, because again, we talked about cases of this in the press, and you see, did they not have, RTOs and RPOs, recovery point objectives of data loss, and that they were measuring, and recovery time objectives of the amount of time it took to get back up from an outage or a disaster? Right? Did they not have? Were they not testing that? Did they not have that? And does being in the cloud or having your DR site in the cloud make those things easier?
It does, and when we're talking, it does. It's interesting you bring up testing of their DR plans, because I've been in this business long enough to see how shockingly infrequent customers do actual DR tests of any kind, whether they be informal or formal. They kind of leave it up to luck as a strategy to see that their applications will come up in whatever DR infrastructure they choose. When we're talking about how to accomplish DR to the cloud, and I'll show some of the use cases in a later slide here, but it really all depends on, first of all, where your production is. Is your production already in the cloud, or is your production on your company-owned virtual infrastructure? Also, it depends who's managing your DR infrastructure. Do you want their DR process? Do you want to manage it yourself, or do you want to have someone else manage it? And then there are ancillary considerations such as, well, what about the networking between? Do I own that? or is it secure? All of these considerations go into the various use cases and ways we do DR to the cloud.
Okay, I just want to remind everybody on the call to please send in questions if you have them. We are moving through some of this, pretty quickly, and I want to make sure that, at any point you all feel comfortable to ask Mike or Harry or Ken any of the questions that you have about some of these different options. So, can you take us through this, Ken, about, what do we mean here by fully managed and self-managed? What are we talking about here, and what are the differences? What do you recommend someone do?
What do I recommend? It really depends on, whether let's just take the issue of management, whether it's self-managed or fully managed or somewhere in between. It really depends on the resources that an enterprise already has and how they're already doing DR. If they already have a management and staff that's perfectly happy and knowledgeable dealing with basically what amounts to a hybrid cloud infrastructure, then they might want to manage it themselves, and also maybe for regulatory requirements, they might want to do that themselves. Or, as you'll see a little bit later, they might want to outsource the entire DR operation to a cloud service provider.
And when you talk fully managed, I wanted to add it's part of services you can gain is even getting to the cloud in the first place. You don't even have to do that yourself. If you work with a cloud provider that's also a consulting partner, and they'll be hand in hand with you this whole way and do as much as you need them to do. Sometimes cost is a factor. So like Mike mentioned earlier, you have all kinds of different paths, even as stepping stones to the cloud. That might be one of them. I might want to be fully managed someday, but it's not in the budget. We have enough resources today. Let's start off self-managed and figure out how this is all working for us and how do we get to a fully managed plan later on. Sometimes those are huge factors just to get your foot in the door.
Would you go to a public cloud as a sort of self-managed and a managed cloud as a shared managed? Is there like a way to set that up that's easy for one or the other? Is there a way to do it that makes sense for public clouds versus managed clouds?
Well, I think more often than not, public clouds assume that you're going self-managed, because the resources are available. That's what the infrastructure as a service is, essentially, that the public clouds make it available. But there are other options as well, as Ken and Harry were discussing earlier. There are options where you can use some of the services and some of the experiences by other vendors to leverage it faster. And if you don't have staff or if you don't have skills, that's what that managed service provider can bring in. And as you can see, there's one of the IBM solutions there, which do have those cloud services, and they can help you on the journey.
So yeah, I'm actually really curious about that. So tell me, can you explain how does IBM Bluemix fit into this? I think customers are curious of what kind of cloud that is and what
Sure.
you can do.
So first of all, just to introduce IBM Cloud, if it needs any introduction, IBM Cloud is certainly one of the tier 1 cloud service providers out there. And it's a little known fact that Zerto, in fact, has quite a few cloud service providers, not all of them tier 1, of course, but IBM Cloud is certainly amongst the major ones. And last year, IBM Cloud chose Zerto to power basically within and integrate within their Bluemix infrastructure Zerto as the engine for powering all of their inter-site data mobility and inter-site workload mobility within the Bluemix infrastructure and IBM Cloud offerings. And IBM Cloud offers a number of different services ranging from infrastructure as a platform through software as a service, passing by applications as a service as well. And IBM Cloud currently has features about 50 worldwide sites. So it's very geographically dispersed, and so they have quite a few site-to-site workload and site-to-site storage requirements, and all of these are internally powered by Zerto, and as you'll see in the next slide, also externally powered by Zerto.
So tell us about what these use cases are.
So there are several interesting use cases that IBM Cloud has deployed Zerto for and leverages it for. On the top left, on-prem to IBM Cloud, typically what this is a customer will have his local vSphere infrastructure. He'll have his a farm of ESX servers that are owned by him on his data center, and he'll want to replicate that to the cloud. And there are a couple of different models here, fully managed or self-managed. Interestingly enough, another subsidiary of IBM, IBM Global Technology Services, offers a turnkey, fully managed DR as a service service. I guess that's redundant. For customers who are using, say, locally vSphere or even Hyper-V, because Zerto has the distinction of being entirely hypervisor heterogeneous. So while IBM Cloud is fundamentally powered by VMware under the covers, it really doesn't matter what kind of hypervisor, whether they're using Hyper-V or VMware on-prem. On the other hand, Cloud offers it basically as a self-managed component of other cloud services. So if a customer wants to manage the full DR experience, shall we say, he can do that and simply use Zerto, which is being provisioned for him by IBM Cloud, and manage that process himself.
So I want to add in there as well, as part of this offering, it's, as Ken mentioned, not exclusive to IBM, but they have a great offering to speak about and see. So part of that vSphere offering in the cloud does give you choices as well, some of those choices we talked about, and point out that a lot of these cloud partners and managed providers do offer multiple avenues to get there, whether it's self-managed or managed service. They don't say, I only do managed services. You have that choice. I want to move workloads there and use infrastructure, or I want to build my own there, or let you do it all for me. So there are choices, and IBM is one of those as well, what you see on the screen.
Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned earlier, IBM also uses Zerto, employs Zerto internally for their own data mobility and workload mobility needs, but also to allow some of their managed service customers to do it themselves. So if a customer is already running in the cloud, such as in the top right diagram here, he can choose to deploy his own replication with a few clicks to somewhere else in the IBM Cloud. And that's something that the IBM Cloud customer can actually deploy and run himself. But it goes a little bit further than that. Plenty of customers today, of course, are contemplating moving their entire workload to the cloud, or at least a portion of their workload, perhaps the less critical stuff initially, get their feet wet. And Zerto, of course, features a mobility workflow, which IBM leverages to facilitate customers who want to do one-time migration of on-prem, say VMware or Hyper-V workloads into the IBM Cloud. And this is, again, powered by Zerto, because we have a workflow that actually facilitates this.
Now, could you move from VMware or Hyper-V then into the IBM Cloud?
That's absolutely correct, you can. Because Zerto is hypervisor heterogeneous, it supports both those hypervisors. It's happy to move those workloads into the IBM Cloud, despite the fact that the IBM Cloud happens to be powered by VMware.
And then what is this about cloud bursting? How is that different than a migration, and what would be a use case for cloud bursting versus migrating?
The fundamental difference between migration and cloud bursting is in migration, we're talking typically a one-time mobility event. In other words, I want to go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side and call it a day. And now I want to decommission some of the applications on the left-hand side from my on-prem infrastructure. Cloud bursting goes two ways. It can basically be used on an as-needed basis. If during the end of the quarter I have more compute needs, or in the holiday season my workload increases, those are the two proverbial cases, of course. I want to spin up additional parallel servers for my databases and for my web servers and so forth, and I don't have the infrastructure or don't want to invest in my physical infrastructure just to handle those couple of months or that couple of days in the quarter. The data, in fact, is already being replicated, usually for DR purposes, to, say, the IBM Cloud or a cloud service provider. Well, why don't I just spin up some parallel workload against that data to handle my temporary needs?
That's huge. That connection of cloud bursting, I think is cool. When I first heard cloud many years ago and thought about how this acts, and people said, this will be great, exactly, the holiday season, my services are hit really hard. I want them to spin up but not have a whole bunch more hypervisor hosts on standby waiting for that once-a-year event. Well, you can still apply that to that DR as a service mentality. I don't need those services until there's a disastrous event. I don't want them on standby somewhere else, and I have to maintain and own that and pay for that. So even if one server might be more expensive for you in one cloud than it is to own it yourself, think about your whole service that you're providing and all your servers and what happens when a disaster strikes or you want to move to the cloud even without DR. That cost actually comes down because you bring in all those operational costs that you're worried about and maintenance of that hardware that you may not even be using most of the year.
So Harry, that kind of brings up maybe the next thing, which is how do you do this with the minimal amount of risk, right? How can you do it so that it's initially something that, right, we saw those questions in the beginning, that's easy to learn how to do, that's easy to figure out what workloads to move, right? What's the low-risk way to get this done or to try moving applications to the cloud?
There are so many factors, and we've hit on a bunch, so I'm going to try to summarize and dig in deep in a few areas. But Mike touched on it earlier, and Ken's touched on this other point. But yes, Zerto is a solution that helps in these situations. There are a lot of solutions that can help, whether it's for DR or not. But the testing portion, how do I try this out without committing? And that's one of the big fears. Do I move workloads there and hope it's going to be okay? And if it's not, to Mike's point earlier, can I get back out? Or am I stuck until I figure it out? And even when you're talking about stepping stones, do I try some of my services and not all of them? But I want control over that. I may not want anybody in the company to swipe a credit card and get them on their own. But a stepping stone to maybe you want native cloud apps. It's the best way for you to move forward in your product roadmap. But you migrate current workloads until you can do that project later on and translate those to native cloud apps and rebuild them all. So being able to test anywhere, anytime, I want to try out Azure, I want to try out Bluemix, I want to try out AWS or any of the hosting providers out there and run workloads there. Yes, replication for DR, software and solutions will get your workloads there and allow you to do that, hopefully, failover test without disruption, without impacting production, so you know how it will perform. Even if take cloud out of the picture, do I have the right hardware there? Is it a lower tier hardware? Did I subscribe to the correct level of service that is my SLA going to accommodate my tests and make sure if I fail over, I can actually bring them all up and perform? Mike?
Yeah, and let me just add to that. So I was talking to a customer who had just exact same problem. They were looking at migration to the cloud and adoption of the cloud, and with using Zerto, they set up a DR replication to the cloud. They brought up service using this testing that Harry just mentioned, and the application didn't work. They discovered a great many of dependencies. They had to allocate budget, allocate time. It took them about 6 months to fix it. So it it can be a quite significant effort to move the application to the cloud. Again, depends on the application. Some are easy, some are hard. There's no way to know until you try it. And when you try it, you will kind of go through these steps of troubleshooting and identifying how to resolve those issues and eventually, get it working and get it operational in the cloud of your choice.
But you want that faith to know you can try it. If it breaks, you're not committed yet, versus a legacy mentality years ago, which caused this fear factor of, yeah, we tried it, it broke, took us 6 months to fix it, and we had a lot of downtime because it wasn't actually a test. It was real life the first time. So being able to move slowly or move partially, and even if it's the conversation that Ken mentioned of crossing hypervisors, I'm a Hyper-V shop and I'm moving into AWS or IBM on vSphere. What happens when it translates? What happens when it boots up in a different hypervisor? Maybe the technology's fine, but maybe operationally I need to learn and train my staff around that new factor. So let's test that as many times as we can. So we want to remove that risk and allow that mobility no matter what you want to do. And the next bullets that are there is how do you make those choices? You've heard a lot of different conversations today, and it's not all clouds are alike. And even if it's the same cloud with multiple offerings, those offerings aren't alike. Different SLAs, I offer silver, gold, platinum, whatever the case may be. So if I run, do they perform correctly? do I have to pay and go to the next level tier to get the right performance for my workloads when they actually do move, or am I only moving half my site so I can do a little bit lower tier and only half of it needs to run? But can I get all these SLAs defined that's appropriate for my business? Even if you think about the backup versus replication mentality, Ken was talking about your RPO times and how long it takes to recover and go back to that data and then recover it, the RTO. We also don't have time for those windows to actually do the backups. They used to take all weekend to run things to tape, so you need that flexibility to move on fast infrastructure with fast solutions that back it. Once you get this all selected and you've tried this provider, try something. If disaster happens, were they there for you? Did they support you through your event? Maybe you don't actually pay for it. Some people that move to the cloud have full intentions of just running workloads there, whatever their initiative is to get there, and maybe weren't thinking DR, or maybe they assumed. Because sometimes cloud comes hand in hand with assumption that it's protected, and if something goes wrong, it's very easy. But everybody's seen all these tweets, like you said, the company reputation of, I lost my data. Well, maybe you actually didn't subscribe to DR as well. You just subscribed to running your workloads. So you have to keep that in mind. If that's part of your initiative is to move and get disaster recovery, figure all that out. And you don't want to be locked in. That second to last bullet, allow for that mobility and that agility. If I build native cloud apps, can they burst when I need it? If I have infrastructure as a service, can it burst? Can I move to a different region? If I'm in IBM's Bluemix Cloud, for example, and I want to do intra-cloud DR, maybe I don't like my workloads on the East Coast, and I'm going to migrate them to another IBM data center on the West Coast. I want that flexibility. I want to be able to get back out. Maybe I commit to running there, but I'll keep my on-prem data center low-key, and I'll DR back to my on-prem. So be able to test this entire solution, whether it's moving and migrating, and then maybe adopting DR once you get there, or having DR into the cloud and testing it anytime you need to make sure you know what's going to happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you. It seems to me like, if I can summarize in some small way, that basically if you've got your business needs and your SLAs, right, your service level agreements that you need to make to your own customers, aligned with whether you want to do this self-service or in a managed way, right, how much of that you want to do, then that should help inform which cloud provider ultimately would make sense for you.
Yeah, understanding the differences and what questions to ask, not just going to a menu and picking one and hoping it's what you expected.
But that ultimately, with any of them, hopefully using Zerto, right, you'd be able to still test.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Get your feet wet, and then come back and make those decisions about whether it actually does meet the SLAs for RPO and RTO, and whether you are comfortable with the level of management with the service provider that you chose.
Even if I didn't want to go too far down the road of Zerto itself and the software, but even current customers that might be listening right now, you might be DRing to an on-prem location you own and you want to try the cloud with the one-to-many feature replicating to multiple places. You could actually also replicate to one of these providers or public cloud providers and try it there without breaking your standard well-known on-prem DR strategy too. So having those choices gives you more faith to remove that risk, is exactly what this slide is showing.
And I'll add, this is Ken, I'll add from a DR point of view, there's nothing stopping you from doing DR to two places simultaneously, if not temporarily, so that if you want to transition to DR to the cloud, you can spin that up pretty simply while still maintaining your traditional DR, because they can certainly run in parallel, mostly unaware of each other. And then when you're satisfied that the DR to the cloud is meeting your RPO and RTO needs from testing, of course, then you can decommission your legacy DR replication solution.
Yeah, that gives you flexibility, and maybe you actually want to maintain two sites in the future because it gives you different SLAs for that application, different disasters you're protecting against. It's not, that mentality. It's a whole another hour we need for a different webinar, but keeping all those options open and knowing them should at least ease your mind when you know you can go to the cloud. And there's a huge misconception that the cloud isn't safe and secure, which we touched on earlier. There are so many compliance factors that a lot of these vendors are making sure they follow, and these are the experts in not only managing and maintaining infrastructure that you may own and also be experts in, but also this, if it's a DR as a service process, they do this every day. You do it hopefully only a few times a year for different types of disasters, but they do it every day. So you don't have to be practicing each time you actually are in an event. They already practice it every day and are ready for you. So there are huge differences, and when you think about compliance, sometimes they're actually meeting a whole slew of standards well more advanced than what you're prepared for on-prem. That when you get your own audit, you say, oh, I didn't realize I had all these holes. Why don't you take that worry away and just watch their checklist that they've done for you? It's actually, you don't need to fear it. You just need to make sure it's right for you.
Okay, thank you very much. You've all made it now to the prize, right? You've made it to this far into the presentation. Thank you. It looks like so many of you have still stayed on to get your 50% off code for ZertoCon. So please come and join us in Boston. We'd love to meet you. If you want to hear more about what to do, if you want to really get some guidance, there will be tons of in-depth sessions. There will also be labs on actually moving workloads yourself into AWS and Azure, and on-prem use cases for migrations. You can try it all out yourself at the event. There will be labs and certifications on all of those things, so you can really see what you're comfortable with. So many of our cloud service providers and partners will be there, so representatives from Microsoft, AWS, IBM, and many of our managed service providers will be there also to answer questions and to help customers sort of figure out this journey. So 50% off if you use the code ZSocial50. Please join us. We would love to see you there. And then just one pitch to continue this specific conversation. We're going to have 3 of the top DR, data protection and replication analysts in the world at ZertoCon discussing how they see disaster recovery and the cloud coming together, how cloud is helping with disaster recovery and data protection. And so John Morency from Gartner, Stephanie Balloras from Forrester, and Henry Balthazar from 451 will be there to talk in depth about what they see is happening in this area, and give some additional advice on this specific aligning business to the cloud era topic. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, to our panelists. This has been a lot of fun, and we will hopefully see you at ZertoCon.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Thank you.